When my wife told me she was leaving just to find her own happiness, I actually believed her. Most people would have seen a red flag the size of a stadium, but I didn't. I didn't see the betrayal because she made it sound like a personal spiritual journey. But here's the question that should have kept me up at night. If she was just looking for herself, why did she need to be so far away from me to find her? We were sitting in our living room on a Tuesday evening. There were no raised voices and no thrown plates. My wife, Sarah, looked at me with a calm, certain expression that was more terrifying than any scream. We had been married for 8 years or so, I thought. In that moment, the woman I shared a bed with looked like a stranger delivering a business report. She told me, "Mark, I don't think I'm happy anymore." I remember nodding slowly, trying to process the words as they hung in the air. I asked her what that meant for us, and she simply said she needed to figure out what happiness looked like for her. I stayed quiet. I didn't realize it then, but my lack of resistance was the first crack in the version of reality she had created. Sarah expected me to beg. She expected a fight that would justify her leaving. By staying calm, I accidentally started a clock I didn't even know existed. She thought she was heading toward a bright, shiny future, but she was actually walking into a void. "I don't think I can find that happiness here," Sarah added. That was the phrase that stuck. Not that she wanted to fix our marriage or that we should see a counselor. She had already checked out. She was just giving me the formal notice. Looking back, I can see the confusion in her eyes when I just said, "All right." She asked if I was sure, and I almost laughed. If someone tells you they want to leave, what exactly are you supposed to fight for? You can't force a heart to stay if it's already halfway out the door. The weeks that followed were unnervingly normal. Usually when a marriage ends, there's an explosion. For us, it was a slow, quiet dissolution. Sarah started packing her things, not all at once but in small waves. A lamp here, a stack of books there. It was like she was erasing herself from our home in installments. One afternoon, she found an old photo of us from a trip to the coast 3 years ago. We were both laughing, drenched from a sudden rainstorm. She asked if I ever thought about how things changed. I looked at the photo, then at her, and said, "Not really." It was a lie, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing my pain. I started noticing things I had missed during our happy years. Sarah was always on her phone lately, smiling at screens but turning cold the second she looked at me. I wondered if finding herself had a name and a face, but I pushed the thought away. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband. She moved out on a Tuesday. There was no dramatic goodbye, just a polite "take care," as she hauled the last suitcase to her car. When the door clicked shut, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was clear. For the first time in years, the tension was gone because the person creating it had finally walked away. The divorce was handled with the same clinical efficiency. It felt less like ending a life together and more like closing a bank account. My friends kept asking how I was holding up, expecting me to be a wreck. I wasn't falling apart, but I wasn't fine either. I was in a strange middle ground. I began clearing out the rest of her fingerprints from the house. I repainted the walls and threw out the furniture she chose. I didn't realize it yet, but I was building a fortress. While I was focused on my new walls, Sarah was out there, finally finding herself. Or so she thought. The first few months after Sarah left were an exercise in relearning how to breathe. I wasn't just living in a house. I was living in a graveyard of our choices. I realized that for years, I had tailored my life to fit her comfort. Now the silence was my own. I started with small things. I changed the coffee brand she hated. I started playing my old records that she always complained were too loud. It felt like I was reclaiming territory inch by inch. Mark, the guy who used to wait for permission to exist, was slowly being replaced by someone I actually liked. One evening, about 6 months into the separation, I ran into an old mutual friend, David, at a local diner. We were making small talk until things got awkward. He hesitated, then asked if I'd heard how Sarah was doing. I told him we didn't speak, and he gave me this look, half pity, half hesitation. He mentioned he'd seen her at a high-end lounge downtown, looking very rejuvenated, with a group of people I didn't recognize. He hinted that she hadn't exactly been finding herself alone. The way he said it made my stomach flip. Was the happiness she sought actually a person she had already lined up? I felt a surge of old anger, but I pushed it down. It didn't matter anymore. She was gone. I chose to double down on my own life instead of chasing ghosts. I went back to the gym, not to get a revenge body, but because the physical pain was easier to manage than the mental fog. I started taking on bigger projects at work, things I'd pushed aside to spend more time with a wife who didn't want to be with me anyway. I was consistent. Every morning at 6 a.m. I was up. Every evening I was learning something new, cooking, coding, anything to keep my mind sharp. I wasn't just moving on, I was evolving. While I was rebuilding, rumors would occasionally drift back to me. Someone saw Sarah at a party, someone else heard she'd moved into a fancy condo. She was living the life she wanted, fast-paced, exciting, and completely unburdened. To the outside world she was winning. She had successfully shed her boring marriage and found the spark. But something about the stories didn't sit right with me. A friend of her sister Jessica, mentioned in passing that Sarah seemed manic rather than happy. She was always on the move, always looking for the next thrill. It made me wonder, if you finally find the happiness you were looking for, why are you still running? A year passed then too. By the second year, the memory of Sarah's voice had started to fade. I could go days without thinking about her. I had a new routine, a peaceful home, and a sense of self-worth that wasn't tied to her approval. I had found my ex, the point where my life finally made sense on its own. I was standing in my kitchen one Friday night, pouring a glass of wine after a long week, feeling genuinely content. The house was warm, the lighting was perfect, and for the first time I didn't feel like someone was missing. And that's exactly when the phone on the counter began to vibrate. I didn't recognize the number. Usually I'd let it go to voicemail, but for some reason my hand moved before my brain could stop it. I picked up and said, "Hello?" There was nothing but static and the sound of heavy, shaky breathing on the other end. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew that breathing. It was a sound I had comforted 1,000 times during her panic attacks or bad dreams. But this felt different. This sounded like someone who had reached the end of a very long, very dark road. Finally, a whisper came through, "Hey." The silence on the line stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I stood in my kitchen, the wine glass still in my hand, paralyzed by a voice I hadn't heard in over 2 years. "Sarah?" I asked, though I already knew. There was a jagged intake of breath on her end. "It's me," she whispered. She sounded smaller than I remembered. The Sarah who had walked out that Tuesday afternoon had been tall, confident, and draped in the armor of her own certainty. This version sounded like she was calling from a bunker. I leaned back against the counter, my pulse slowing into a steady, cold rhythm. "What's going on, Sarah?" I asked. I wasn't angry. I was just present. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice trembled just enough to be noticeable. I didn't answer immediately. I looked around my living room, the one I had repainted, the one where I had finally found peace. I thought about the ex I had found, that intersection where my life finally belonged to me again. "About what?" I countered. I wasn't being difficult. I genuinely wanted to know what could possibly be left to say after 2 years of total radio silence. "Everything," she said. It was a loaded word. Everything usually means nothing, or it means a confession that's 2 years too late. We agreed to meet at a small bistro downtown a few days later. When I walked into that bistro, I expected to feel a surge of old pain. Instead, I felt like I was watching a movie of someone else's life. I already knew this wasn't going to end the way she expected. Sarah was already there, tucked into a corner booth. She looked different. The expensive clothes and the polished new life look David had described were gone. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired you get from a long day at work, but the soul-deep exhaustion that comes from realizing you've been running in the wrong direction for miles. She looked up as I approached, and for the first time in our decade-long history, she didn't look like she was in control. We sat down, and for a long minute, the only sound was the clinking of silverware from the other tables. I noticed her hands. They were resting on the table and they were shaking, just a subtle rhythmic vibration she couldn't suppress. "Are you okay?" I asked. It was a reflex, a ghost of the husband I used to be. She nodded too quickly, her eyes darting around the room before landing on mine. "Yeah, I've been wanting to call you for a long time, Mark." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Why didn't you?" I asked. The question hung there, a reminder of the 700 days of silence she had chosen. Sarah looked down at her coffee, her shoulders sinking. "I thought I made the right choice," she said, and I heard the first crack in her voice. I really believed it. I thought leaving would make everything clearer. Easier. Better. I stayed silent, letting her words fill the gap. She admitted that at first the freedom felt like the happiness she had been chasing. New people, new bars, no one to answer to. She gave a small hollow laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought that was it. I thought that was the happiness I was missing here." Then her expression shifted, and the tears she had been holding back finally began to pool. "But it wasn't," she whispered. "It doesn't last, Mark." The more time passed, the more I realized something was missing. I watched her carefully, looking for any sign of a performance, but all I saw was a woman who had finally hit a wall. "What was missing?" I asked, my voice steady. She looked up at me and the tears finally spilled over. "Depth," she said. The word hit the table like a lead weight. She had traded a mountain for a handful of shiny pebbles, and she was only just now realizing the trade wasn't even. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper as if she was confessing a crime. She described the first 6 months after she left as a blur of adrenaline. She had met a guy named Julian, a free spirit, who lived in a loft and didn't believe in schedules. He was the polar opposite of the stable, predictable life we had built. She thought Julian was the key to the happiness she'd been missing. She thought the late nights and the lack of responsibility were finding herself. But as the months rolled by, the adrenaline started to taste like battery acid. Julian wasn't a free spirit. He was just someone who didn't care enough to stay. I kept chasing this idea of being happy, Sarah continued, wiping her eyes with a shaking hand. But everything felt temporary. It was like I was eating air, Mark. I was full for a second, and then I was starving again. She admitted that she had spent thousands of dollars on experiences, trips to Tulum, expensive dinners, a new wardrobe, trying to fill a hole that just kept getting wider. Every time she posted a photo of her perfect new life on social media, she felt like a fraud. She was performing happiness for an audience of strangers while she was crying in her car outside the grocery store. I thought I could replace what we had, she said, her voice finally breaking. I thought a marriage was just a set of habits I could swap out for better ones. I was so wrong. She looked at me, searching my face for a flicker of the old Mark, the one who would have reached across the table to hold her hand. But I stayed still. I was listening, but I wasn't participating in her grief. I had already done my time in that particular prison. I've been miserable, she admitted. It was the first time she had said it out loud, and the weight of the confession seemed to physically bow her shoulders. I didn't want to admit it, she added. Not to my sister, not to my friends. I had told everyone I was finally free. How do you tell people your freedom is actually a nightmare? She explained that she had reached a breaking point 3 months ago. She was sitting in her fancy condo, surrounded by things she had bought to make herself feel successful, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had felt safe. Not excited, not happy, but safe. That's when the image of our boring, quiet living room started haunting her. That's when she realized that boring was actually the sound of peace. And what point was that? I asked. I wanted to know the exact moment the mirage faded. Sarah hesitated, looking at her reflection in the dark coffee. It was the night I got the flu, she whispered. I was laying on the bathroom floor, shivering, and I realized there was no one to call. Julian was out at some gallery opening. My new friends didn't do sick days. And all I could think about was the time I had that fever back in year 4, and you stayed up all night putting cold cloths on my forehead. She looked up, her eyes raw. I realized, no matter what I did, I kept thinking about you. There it was. The hook she had been trying to set since she dialed my number. I miss you, she said, and this time her voice broke completely. She started crying, not the pretty, controlled cry of a movie star, but the ugly, snot-nosed sobbing of someone who has lost their way in a storm. She reached into her bag for a tissue, but her hands were shaking too hard to find one. 3 years ago, this sight would have destroyed me. I would have been around that table in a heartbeat, taking her weight onto my own. But now, I just sat there, watching the woman who had traded our life for a vibe, realize that vibes don't hold your hand when you're shaking. Sarah finally found a tissue, but the tears didn't stop. They were coming from a place of pure, unrefined regret. I made a mistake, Mark, she said through her sobs. A massive, life-altering mistake. I let the words hang in the air between us, as heavy as a funeral shroud. I didn't rush to comfort her, and I didn't jump in with a "told you so." I just let her sit in the mess she had spent 2 years making. She leaned forward, her eyes searching mine for even a spark of the old devotion. I thought I needed to leave to be happy, she whispered. But I lost the only thing that actually mattered. The silence that followed was thick. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a life-changing decision. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. I want to come back, she said. There it was. The ultimate pivot. The woman who had treated our marriage like a restrictive cage was now begging to be let back inside. I know I don't deserve it, she added quickly, her words tripping over each other. I know I hurt you. I know I walked away when things were boring. But I've learned my lesson, Mark. I'm different now. I promise. I looked at her. I really looked at her. I didn't see the villain of my story, and I didn't see the love of my life either. For the first time, I saw a woman who had simply lost herself in a hall of mirrors. She had chased a ghost and caught it, only to realize that ghosts don't have hearts. She looked fragile, like a house of cards waiting for a light breeze. I believe you, I said calmly. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, a flash of pure, unadulterated hope lit up her face. It was the fastest emotional transformation I had ever seen. You do? She asked, her voice lifting. She actually started to reach her hand across the table, toward mine. I didn't move my hand, but I didn't take hers either. I do, I nodded, keeping my tone level. I think you're telling the truth. I think you really are miserable, and I think you really do miss what we had. The hope in her eyes was glowing now, almost blinding. She started to smile, a shaky, relieved expression. But then I cleared my throat. But that doesn't change anything, Sarah. The smile vanished so fast it was like someone had flipped a switch. What do you mean? She stammered. I leaned in, not out of aggression but for clarity. I mean, you left to find happiness, I said. She nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in confusion. And while you were out there looking for it, I stayed here and built mine. I watched that sentence hit her. It wasn't a blow to the face, it was a slow-acting poison. The realization began to dawn on her that while she was tearing things down, I was laying a foundation. I'm not the same person you left on that Tuesday, I continued. The Mark you knew, the one who would have waited forever for you to come home, he didn't survive the divorce. He died the day you told me our life wasn't enough. Sarah's lower lip began to tremble again. She realized that she wasn't just asking for her old life back, she was asking for a man who no longer existed. She was trying to walk back through a door that I had replaced with a solid brick wall months ago. Sarah stared at me and the realization finally sank in. She wasn't just looking at her ex-husband, she was looking at a stranger who occupied his skin. I thought maybe, if I showed you how much I've changed. She started, her voice trailing off into a whisper. I shook my head slowly. I know, I said gently. But you didn't change for me, Sarah. You changed because you ran out of options. There's a big difference between choosing someone and choosing a safety net. The bistro was still buzzing with other people's lives, but our table felt like an island in the middle of a cold ocean. I just want one chance, she whispered, her eyes pleading. I looked her dead in the eye and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace. You already had one, Sarah. You had 8 years of chances. You had 3,000 mornings to decide that what we had was enough. You chose to leave because you thought there was something better. Now that you've seen the better, and realized it's hollow, you can't just expect me to be the consolation prize. That was it. The air in the room shifted. This was the exact moment my life reached its point X. The intersection where the pain of her betrayal finally transformed into the power of my own independence. I wasn't defined by her leaving anymore, and I certainly wasn't going to be defined by her coming back. I stood up, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to look back to see if she was following. I had built a life that didn't require her validation to be complete. As I walked out of that bistro into the cool evening air, I realized that Sarah finally found exactly what she was looking for, the truth about what she had thrown away. But by the time she understood the value of our depth, I had already found a version of happiness that didn't depend on anyone else. Every life finds its ex, and mine was found in the silence of a home that finally felt like it belonged to me. If you've ever watched someone walk away, and come back too late, subscribe. This is where those stories find their ending. If this story reminded you that your worth isn't tied to someone else's mistakes, please hit the like button. It helps us reach more people who are searching for their own inner justice. Have you ever had an ex try to come back after realizing the grass wasn't greener? Write your experience in the comments. I read every